Hello and welcome to Your Property Empire. I'm Chris Gray. On tonight's show, the 2017 PIPA Annual Investor Sentiment Survey has just been released, which takes a snapshot of Australia's existing and aspiring property investors. What is the mood, the confidence and the key trends underlying the nation's real estate investment market? Is it a good time to be investing in real estate? And how can you tackle the issue of rising borrowing costs? But first up, let's check in with Charles Tarbey from Century 21 to see what's happening with the property market around Australasia. Good to see you, Charles.
Thank you, Chris.
My pleasure. Let's jump in with the auction clearance rates.
Yeah, still pretty steady. I mean, we don't like auction clearance rates when they're too high. We don't like them when they're too low. It gets a bit tough, but this time around, they're not too bad at all. The clearance rates across the country were 68.1%. Now, Sydney's been in decline for a little while, and there's a lot of talk about that. But there's still growth in Sydney, even though it's been in decline. It came in at 67.2%, whereas Melbourne still, with 1,111 auctions, came in at 72.1%. So it's moving along very nicely. Other capital cities weren't too bad either. They were in the 50s and 60s, which is still very good clearance rates.
Wonderful. Sounds good. And is there many properties coming on the market?
Yeah, we've had steady growth for the last few weeks, Chris, and I know you see that stat climb as much as it can. But this week, it's done it for you. It's come in at 2.13% up over this time last week. So it is really starting to move along, and that with a lack of interest at some auctions around the countryside and only being one or two buyers turning up is really starting to level the marketplace out across the entire country, particularly in the hot areas of Sydney and Melbourne.
Now, in terms of the difference in buyers, are the agents noticing quite a difference between overseas investors, the investors in Australia and also the home buyers and first home buyers? Yeah,
look, there's a lot of money being stopped from coming into the country, particularly from the Asia-Pacific region, which was where we were relying upon it in the early days. So I think there is a definite slowdown there, but the prices of some of the capital cities, and we're starting to look now even closer at Brisbane. I was talking to the guys from Redcliffe today in Brisbane, and they said that marketplace has taken off, which is north of Brisbane. And we said, why? They said, well, it's because people from Brisbane are buying up in Redcliffe because it's cheaper in Redcliffe. People in Sydney and Melbourne are buying up in Brisbane because it's cheaper in Brisbane than it is in Sydney and Melbourne. Now, it's a very interesting move in those regions. So I expect a lot of interest from overseas in the Brisbane market over the coming year.
Wonderful. And what's happening with the rent price movements?
Not a lot. Sydney had the best climb, 0.55% for the week. We also had Hobart and Adelaide come in at 0.26% and 0.27% respectively. Other capital cities were negative, but overall there was completely zero change in the rent movement right across the country. But it's interesting to watch those three capital cities starting to move a little bit better. And finally, the vacancy rates. Yeah, now this is a really interesting one. We've been watching the Melbourne market and Perth market. Now Perth came in a steady 8.18%. It's been sitting in the early 8s for the last few weeks. Sydney came in at 1.1%, but astonishingly, Melbourne continues to shine, and the Melbourne marketplace came in at 0.65% vacancy. I mean, 3.31 with those three capital cities, but that's extraordinary, a 0.65% vacancy rate.
Now, just finally, before you go, I know CoreLogic came out maybe a couple of weeks ago and was talking that Sydney was, I think, down to maybe minus 0.1, I think maybe for the month or the quarter in terms of capital growth. Have you seen a big change around Sydney? We're just seeing a lot of steady parts in Sydney. Some of the auctioneers will tell you that people are making a lot of offers before auction, and quite often the auctioneers and the agents are suggesting to sellers to take it. So there's definitely a change in that marketplace. And I really must say to you, Chris, it's a welcome change from my perspective. Wonderful. Well, thanks for joining us, and we'll see you again next week. Thank you, Chris.